Hello and welcome back to Project 380. On today's episode I'm going to be upgrading the steering rack and renewing the steering components. So I'm going to be renewing the tie rod and the track rod end for nice fresh new ones, and to start off with we need to loosen off the lock nut on the tie rod. The lock nut is there to stop the tie rod going in and out of the track rod end to keep your alignment. There's a problem here. I appear to be missing my lock nut. So usually you would undo your lock nut and then wind the tie rod out of the track rod end, but mine's completely seized. So I'll be skipping that step and I'm just going to be taking a grinder to it. The next step would be to remove the split pin from the castle nut on the track rod end, then remove the castle nut, and then you would remove your track rod end from your hub. And there's a couple of ways to do that. There's a few different tools out there which will clamp and force the track rod end out, but I don't like to use them as sometimes they will split the rubber boot. But the way I like to do it is by using a hammer. Now if you were reusing the track rod end, simply hit the hub and it will just pop out. But if you're not going to be reusing it, hit it on the thread, damage the thread instead. Now with your tie rod and your track rod end separated, you can remove your steering gator boot. And to do that you first need to remove the clips either end. In my case, because I've already replaced them, they are metal tie wraps. So I can simply snip those off. Then this can simply be pulled off. So to separate the tie rod from the rack, we first need to bend the two tabs on this locking. And then to separate the two, you would simply put a spanner on the flats here, or grab this part of the tie rod with a great big pair of water pump pliers. But I've got a special tool that takes out all the hard work. So if you were just renewing your tie rods or putting in rack spacers, now you can go ahead and put it all back together. But for me, I'm going to be taking the steering rack off as I'm going to be changing the bushers. Now I've already done this in previous videos, so I'm just going to give you a quick recap. First thing you're going to want to do is get your steering wheel nice and straight. And then remove your steering lines from your power steering cooler and your power steering pump. And then undo the bolt on the universal joint of your steering column, and then undo the 4 bolts that hold your steering rack to your subframe, and then simply remove it. Now the whole point of me removing the rack is to give it a freshen up and replace the bushers. Now this is the Mark II rack. It's a little bit different to the Mark I rack. In this end of the Mark II rack there is 2 pressed in bushers, whereas this end it is just held in with a clamp. So I need to remove these bushers this end, and you can see I've already removed one. And how I've done that is with a ball joint clamp like this. Simply pressed it straight out the rack. Now the bush the other end, you simply remove the clamp that holds the rack to the subframe, and there's a split in the bushing and you simply peel it off. Now I'm going to give this a good clean and a lick of paint. Now that the steering rack is painted and dry, it's time to fit the poly bushers, and I've got the steering rack set from Flowflex. I'll pop the link for these down in the description below. Hopefully these will stiffen up the steering rack a little bit, and because they are a split bushing, it's going to give me the option for serviceability rather than pressing the bushers out. So I'll start with the big bush on the left hand side of the rack, pop a little bit of lubricant on it, then there's a split, opens up and can be put onto the rack. Then a little bit of lubricant on the outside, and pop the clamp on top. Now the split bushes on the right hand side of the rack are just like any other split bush. Split them apart and pop both halves into the rack. And grab the metal insert, lube that up and squeeze it in. Once you've wiped off the excess lube, it's ready to go back into the car. So before refitting the rack, make sure the steering wheel is still in its central position. This is going to help you when it comes to alignment time. And in the case of a Mark II MB, you want to do up the 2 bolts with the 2 bushes first and then do up the 2 bolts with the clamp. This is going to help align the rack to the subframe. So now on to rebuilding the rest of the steering components, and the next thing to go on is going to be the tie rods. Everything I'm putting on now is going to be a temporary setup, as in the future I am going to change it. But I need to work out a few other things in the car first. Now if you're into drifting, I'm sure you've heard the term rack spacer. The rack spacer goes on now, it goes on the tie rod, in between the tie rod and the rack. This is going to add a little bit of length to the steering rack and allow the rack to travel further lock to lock, which then means you've got a little bit more steering angle. Now if you are fitting rack spacers, the locking tabs that were on the end of the tie rods beforehand now are pretty much useless, so I'm not going to bother putting those in. So I've got myself a brand new tie rod end, and the rack spacer simply slots over the threads on the end where it goes into the rack. Now because this isn't holding on as many threads as it used to, it's a good idea just to put a little bit of blue Loctite on the end. Then you can slide on the rack gaiter. Now for the track rod end. I've just gone for a standard one for now, but as you can see I'm using the full destroy or die front suspension setup, and because I've got it set to maximum track width, the track rod end and the tie rod don't quite meet. So just a temporary step, I have got an extender that winds into the track rod end. So I'm going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on the male thread of the extender and wind that into the track rod end. Apply a little bit of grease to your tie rod and then wind on your track rod end. And then you can pop the steering assembly into the hub. Then pop the castle nut on. And then pop the split pin through. Now that the assembly's together, you can make sure the tie rack extender is nice and tight into the track rod end. Now because of the way these extensions work, I may have to cut down my tie rod so I get the alignment true. But that's a small price to pay with the setup that I have got. The next step would be to pop the wheel on, pop the car on the floor and align it by eye, and then do up the lock nut. But I'm not quite ready to drop the car to the floor just yet, so I'll be covering that in a future video. Like I said earlier, this is not going to be my final steering setup. In the future, once I've decided what wheels I'm going to be running and what space I have got to play with, I may well change this to a rose jointed track rod end. And I may play with the steering rack spacers to a different design or a different size. But of course there are limitations to what I can use. Also, or depending on what lock I can use, I may have to change the bolt that holds the coilover to the lower control arm, as at the minute the tie rod is hitting the head of the bolt. So that is the steering assembly upgraded, renewed and installed. All I've got to do in the future is plumb it all in and bleed it up and get an alignment. So that's all for this episode. If this helped you in any way, make sure to give it a comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.